We have now reached the point from which the more academic school of alienists date Charles Ward's madness. Upon his discovery, the youth had looked immediately at a few of the inner pages of the book and manuscripts, and had evidently seen something which impressed him tremendously. Indeed, in showing the titles to the workmen, he appeared to guard the text itself with peculiar care, and to labor under a perturbation for which even the antiquarian and genealogical significance of the find could hardly account. Upon returning home, he broke the news with an almost embarrassed air, as if he wished to convey an idea of its supreme importance without having to exhibit the evidence itself. He did not even show the titles to his parents, but simply told them that he had found some documents in Joseph Curwen's handwriting, mostly in cipher, which would have to be studied very carefully before yielding up their true meaning. It is unlikely that he would have shown what he did to the workmen had it not been for their unconcealed curiosity. As it was, he doubtless wished to avoid any display of peculiar reticence which would increase their discussion of the matter. That night, Charles Ward sat up in his room reading the new-found book and papers, and when day came he did not desist. His meals, on his urgent request when his mother called to see what was amiss, were sent up to him, and in the afternoon he appeared only briefly when the men came to install the Curwen picture and mantelpiece in his study. The next night he slept in snatches in his clothes, meanwhile wrestling feverishly with the unraveling of the cipher manuscript. In the morning his mother saw that he was at work on the photostatic copy of the Hutchinson cipher, which he had frequently shown her before, but in response to her query he said that the Curwen key could not be applied to it. That afternoon he abandoned his work and watched the men fascinatedly as they finished their installation of the picture with its woodwork above a cleverly realistic electric log, setting the mock fireplace and overmantel a little out from the north wall as if a chimney existed, and boxing in the sides with paneling to match the rooms. The front panel holding the picture was sawn and hinged to allow a cupboard space behind it. After the workman went, he moved his work into the study and sat down before it with his eyes half on the cipher and half on the portrait, which stared back at him like a year-adding and century-recalling mirror. His parents, subsequently recalling his conduct at this period, give interesting details anent the policy of concealment which he practiced. Before servants he seldom hid any paper which he might be studying, since he rightly assumed that Curwen's intricate and archaic chirography would be too much for them. With his parents, however, he was more circumspect, and unless the manuscript in question were a cipher, or a mere mass of cryptic symbols and unknown ideographs, as that entitled "To Him Who Shall Come After," etc., seemed to be, he would cover it with some convenient paper until his caller had departed. At night he kept the papers under lock and key in an antique cabinet of his, where he also placed them whenever he left the room. He soon resumed fairly regular hours and habits, except that his long walks and other outside interests seemed to cease. The opening of school, where he now began his senior year, seemed a great bore to him, and he frequently asserted his determination never to bother with college. He had, he said, important special investigations to make, which would provide him with more avenues toward knowledge and the humanities than any university which the world could boast. Naturally, only one who had always been more or less studious, eccentric, and solitary could have pursued this course for many days without attracting notice. Ward, however, was constitutionally a scholar and a hermit. Hence his parents were less surprised than regretful at the close confinement and secrecy he adopted. At the same time, both his father and mother thought it odd that he would show them no scrap of his treasure trove, nor give any connected account of such data as he had deciphered. This reticence he explained away as due to a wish to wait until he might announce some connected revelation, but as the weeks passed without further disclosures, there began to grow up between the youth and his family a kind of constraint, intensified in his mother's case by her manifest disapproval of all Curwen delvings. During October, Ward began visiting the libraries again, but no longer for the antiquarian matter of his former days. Witchcraft and magic, occultism and demonology were what he sought now, and when Providence sources proved unfruitful, he would take the train for Boston and tap the wealth of the Great Library in Copley Square, the Widener Library at Harvard, or the Zion Research Library in Brookline, where certain rare works on biblical subjects are available. He bought extensively and fitted up a whole additional set of shelves in his study for newly acquired works on uncanny subjects, while during the Christmas holidays he made a round of out-of-town trips, including one to Salem, to consult certain records at the Essex Institute. About the middle of January 1920, there entered Ward's bearing an element of triumph which he did not explain, and he was no more found at work upon the Hutchinson cipher. Instead, he inaugurated a dual policy of chemical research and record scanning, fitting up for the one a laboratory in the unused attic of the house, and for the latter haunting all the sources of vital statistics in Providence. Local dealers in drugs and scientific supplies, later questioned, gave astonishingly queer and meaningless catalogues of the substances and instruments he purchased. But clerks at the State House, the City Hall, and the various libraries agree as to the definite object of his second interest. He was searching intensely and feverishly for the grave of Joseph Curwen, from whose slate slab the older generation had so wisely blotted the name. Little by little, there grew upon the Ward family the conviction that something was wrong. Charles had his freaks and changes of minor interests before, but this growing secrecy and absorption in strange pursuits was unlike even him. His schoolwork was the merest pretense, and although he failed in no test, it could be seen that the old application had all vanished. He had other concernments now, and when not in his new laboratory with a score of obsolete alchemical books, could be found either poring over old burial records downtown or glued to his volumes of occult lore in his study, where the startlingly, one almost fancied increasingly, similar features of Joseph Curwen stared blandly at him from the great overmantel on the north wall. Late in March, Ward added to his archive searching a ghoulish series of rambles about the various ancient cemeteries of the city. The cause appeared later, when it was learned from City Hall clerks that he had probably found an important clue. His quest had suddenly shifted from the grave of Joseph Curwen to that of one Naphtali Field, and that this shift was explained when, upon going over the files that he had been over, the investigators actually found a fragmentary record of Curwen's burial which had escaped the general obliteration, and which stated that the curious leaden coffin had been interred 10 feet south and 5 feet west of Naphtali Field's grave in Ye. The lack of a specified burying ground in the surviving entry greatly complicated the search, and Naphtali Field's grave seemed as elusive as that of Curwen. But here no systematic effacement had existed, and one might reasonably be expected to stumble on the stone itself, even if its record had perished. Hence the rambles, from which St. John's, the former king's churchyard, and the ancient congregational burying ground in the midst of Swan Point Cemetery were excluded, since other statistics had shown that the only Naphtali Field, obit 1729, whose grave could have been meant, had been a Baptist. It was toward May when Dr. Willett, at the request of the senior Ward, and fortified with all the Curwen data which the family had gleaned from Charles in his non-secretive days, talked with the young man. The interview was of little value or conclusiveness, for Willett felt at every moment that Charles was thoroughly master of himself and in touch with matters of real importance. But it at least forced the secretive youth to offer some rational explanation of his recent demeanor. Of a pallid, impassive type, not easily showing embarrassment, Ward seemed quite ready to discuss his pursuits, though not to reveal their object. He stated that the papers of his ancestor had contained some remarkable secrets of early scientific knowledge, for the most part in cipher, of an apparent scope comparable only to the discoveries of Friar Bacon, and perhaps surpassing even those. They were, however, meaningless, except when correlated with the body of learning now wholly obsolete, so that their immediate presentation to a world equipped only with modern science would rob them of all impressiveness and dramatic significance. To take their vivid place in history of human thought, they must first be correlated by one familiar with the background out of which they evolved, and to this task of correlation Ward was now devoting himself. He was seeking to acquire, as fast as possible, those neglected arts of old which a true interpreter of the Kirwan data must possess, and hoped in time to make a full announcement and presentation of the utmost interest to mankind and to the world of thought. Not even Einstein, he declared, could more profoundly revolutionize the current conception of things. As to his graveyard search, whose object he freely admitted, but the details of whose progress he did not relate, he said he had reason to think that Joseph Kirwan's mutilated headstone bore certain mystic symbols, carved from directions in his will and ignorantly spared by those who had effaced the name, which were absolutely essential to the final solution of his cryptic system. Kirwan, he believed, had wished to guard his secret with care, and had consequently distributed the data in an exceedingly curious fashion. When Dr. Willett asked to see the mystic documents, Ward displayed much reluctance and tried to put him off with such things as photostatic copies of the Hutchinson cipher and Orne formula and diagrams, but finally showed him the exteriors of some of the real Kirwan finds, the journal and notes, the cipher, title and cipher also, and the formula-filled message to him who shall come after, and let him glance inside such as were in obscure characters. He also opened the diary at a page carefully selected for its innocuousness, and gave Willett a glimpse of Kirwan's connected handwriting in English. The doctor noted very closely the crabbed and complicated letters, and the general aura of the 17th century which clung round both penmanship and style, despite the writer's survival into the 18th century, and became quickly certain that the document was genuine. The text itself was relatively trivial, and Willett recalled only a fragment. Wednesday, 16th of October, 1754. My sloop, the Wakeful, this day put in from London with 20 new men picked up in ye Indies, Spaniards from Martinico, and 2 Dutchmen from Suriname. Ye Dutchmen are like to desert from having heard somewhat ill of these ventures, but I will see to ye inducing of them to stay. For Mr. Knight Dexter of ye Boy and Book 120 pieces camblets, 100 pieces assorted cambletines, 20 pieces blue duffels, 100 pieces shalloons, 50 pieces calamancos, 300 pieces each shensoy and hum-hums. For Mr. Green at ye Elephant 50-gallon kettles, 20 warming pans, 15 bake kettles, 10 smoking tongs. For Mr. Perigo 1 set of awls. For Mr. Nightingale 50 reams prime foolscap. Said ye Sabaoth thrice last night, but none appeared. I must hear from Mr. H. in Transylvania, though it is hard reaching him, and exceeding strange he cannot give me the use of what he hath so well used these 100 years. Simon hath not writ these 5 weeks, but I expect soon hearing from him. When, upon reaching this point, Dr. Willett turned the leaf, he was quickly checked by Ward, who almost snatched the book from his grasp. All that the doctor had a chance to see on the newly opened page was a brief pair of sentences, but these, strangely enough, lingered tenaciously in his memory. They ran, Ye verse from Liber Damnatus, being spoke 5 Roodemases and 4 hollow eves, I am hopeful ye thing is breeding outside ye spheres. It will draw one who is to come, if I can make sure he shall be, and he shall think on past things, and look back through all ye years, against ye which I must have ready, ye salts or that to make them with. Willett saw no more, but somehow this small glimpse gave a new and vague terror to the painted features of Joseph Curwen, which stared blandly down from the overmantel. Ever after that he entertained the odd fancy, which his medical skill of course assured him was only a fancy, that the eyes of the portrait had a sort of wish, if not an actual tendency, to follow young Charles Ward as he moved about the room. He stopped before leaving to study the picture closely, marveling at its resemblance to Charles, and memorizing every minute detail of the cryptical, colorless face, even down to a slight scar or pit in the smooth brow above the right eye. Cosmo Alexander, he decided, was a painter worthy of the Scotland that produced Raeburn, and a teacher worthy of his illustrious pupil, Gilbert Stuart. Assured by the doctor that Charles' mental health was in no danger, but that, on the other hand, he was engaged in researches which might prove of real importance, the Wards were more lenient than they might otherwise have been when, during the following June, the youth made positive his refusal to attend college. He had, he declared, studies of much more vital importance to pursue, and intimated a wish to go abroad the following year in order to avail himself of certain sources of data not existing in America. The senior Ward, while denying this latter wish as absurd for a boy of only 18, acquiesced regarding the university, so that after a none too brilliant graduation from the Moses Brown School, there ensued for Charles a 3-year period of intensive occult study and graveyard searching. He became recognized as an eccentric, and dropped even more completely from the sight of his family's friends than he had been before. Keeping close to his work and only occasionally making trips to other cities to consult obscure records. Once he went south to talk with a strange old mulatto who dwelt in a swamp and about whom a newspaper had printed a curious article. Again he sought a small village in the Adirondacks, whence reports of certain odd ceremonial practices had come, but still his parents forbade him the trip to the old world which he desired. Coming of age in April 1923, and having previously inherited a small competence from his maternal grandfather, Ward determined at last to take the European trip hitherto denied him. Of his proposed itinerary he would say nothing save that the needs of his studies would carry him to many places, but he promised to write his parents fully and faithfully. When they saw he could not be dissuaded, they ceased all opposition and helped as best they could, so that in June the young man sailed for Liverpool with the farewell blessings of his father and mother, who accompanied him to Boston and waved him out of sight from the White Star Pier in Charleston. Letters soon told of his safe arrival and of his securing good quarters in Great Russell Street, London, where he proposed to stay, shunning all family friends till he had exhausted the resources of the British Museum in a certain direction. Of his daily life he wrote but little, for there was little to write. Study and experiment consumed all his time, and he mentioned a laboratory which he had established in one of his rooms. That he said nothing of antiquarian rambles in the glorious old city with its luring skyline of ancient domes and steeples, and its tangles of roads and alleys whose mystic convolutions and sudden vistas alternately beckon and surprise, was taken by his parents as a good index of the degree to which his new interests had engrossed his mind. In June 1924, a brief note told of his departure for Paris, to which he had before made 1 or 2 flying trips for material in the Bibliothèque Nationale. For 3 months thereafter he sent only postal cards, giving an address in the Rue Saint-Jacques and referring to a special search among rare manuscripts in the library of an unnamed private collector. He avoided acquaintances, and no tourists brought back reports of having seen him. Then came a silence, and in October the Wards received a picture card from Prague, Czechoslovakia, stating that Charles was in that ancient town for the purpose of conferring with a certain very aged man, supposed to be the last living possessor of some very curious medieval information. He gave an address in the Neustadt and announced no move till the following January, when he dropped several cards from Vienna telling of his passage through that city on the way toward a more easterly region, whither one of his correspondents and fellow delvers into the occult had invited him. The next card was from Klausenburg in Transylvania, and told of Ward's progress toward his destination. He was going to visit a Baron Ferenczi, whose estate lay in the mountains east of Rackus, and was to be addressed at Rackus in the care of that nobleman. Another card from Rackus a week later, saying that his host's carriage had met him and that he was leaving the village for the mountains, was his last message for a considerable time. Indeed, he did not reply to his parents' frequent letters until May, when he wrote to discourage the plan of his mother for a meeting in London, Paris, or Rome during the summer, when the elder Wards were planning to travel in Europe. His researches, he said, were such that he could not leave his present quarters, while the situation of Baron Ferenczi's castle did not favor visits. It was on a crag in the dark wooded mountains, and the region was so shunned by the country folk that normal people could not help feeling ill at ease. Moreover, the Baron was not a person likely to appeal to correct and conservative New England gentlefolk. His aspect and manners had idiosyncrasies, and his age was so great as to be disquieting. It would be better, Charles said, if his parents would wait for his return to Providence, which could scarcely be far distant. That return did not, however, take place until May 1926, when, after a few heralding cards, the young wanderer quietly slipped into New York on the Homeric, and traversed the long miles to Providence by motor coach, eagerly drinking in the green rolling hills, the fragrant blossoming orchids, and the white steepled towns of Vernal, Connecticut. His first taste of ancient New England in nearly 4 years. When the coach crossed the Pawcatuck and entered Rhode Island amidst the fairy goldness of a late spring afternoon, his heart beat with quickened force, and the entry to Providence along Reservoir and Elmwood avenues was a breathless and wonderful thing, despite the depths of forbidden lore to which he had delved. At the high square, where Broad, Wabasset, and Empire Streets join, he saw before and below him in the fire of sunset the pleasant, remembered houses and domes and steeples of the old town, and his head swam curiously as the vehicle rolled down the terminal behind the Biltmore, bringing into view the great dome and soft roof-pierced greenery of the ancient hill across the river, and the tall colonial spire of the First Baptist Church, limed pink in the magic evening light against the fresh springtime verdure of its precipitous background. Old Providence. It was this place and the mysterious forces of its long continuous history which had brought him into being, and which had drawn him back toward marvels and secrets whose boundaries no prophet might fix. Here lay the arcana, wondrous or dreadful, as the case might be, for which all his years of travel and application had been preparing him. A taxicab rolled him through Post Office Square, with its glimpse of the river, the old market house, and the head of the bay, and up the steep, curved slope of Waterman Street to Prospect, where the vast gleaming dome and sunset-flushed Ionic columns of the Christian Science Church beckoned northward. Then 8 squares past the fine old estates his childish eyes had known, and the quaint brick sidewalks so often trodden by his youthful feet. And at last the little white overtaken farmhouse on the right. On the left, the classic Adam porch and stately bayed facade of the great brick house where he was born. It was twilight, and Charles Dexter Ward had come home.